Good day, folks. Thanks for coming to find the warmth of our sun here at Madison 365. I am your host, Matthew Brownman. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. It's I think this week has been it's been a tough one for a lot of not just Asian Americans, Asians in America, and the diversity of Asians and just people of color in general. Is a lot happened, and specifically around the killings in Alabama. The media narrative has been, in my opinion, absolutely trash. The police have done what they've done, and there's been a laundering of. It's a typical behavior of that happens when particularly white men have gone on killing sprees that have targeted blacks, black folks, brown folks, Asians, Jewish folks, right? And there's context that's always missed. And within this, there's a really interesting thing that happened was basically the police in their statement said that, told the press the reason why the killer did what they did from the killer's mouth. So it was like his reasoning, right? The murderer's reason. But they didn't do any qualifiers, anything. They barely say is like he said he had a bad day and suffered from sex addiction, and we don't think race had anything to do with it because of what he said. The press picked up on that because they still run with this idea that, one, the police don't have bias, that they don't lie. The official narrative is always on from the police end, and they give credence to it. But let's think about this. And increasingly, I want to kind of bring up this, come to the conclusion that not just a legal definition, but even just the language we use in saying hate crime is insufficient to properly explain what's going on, because hate gives an explanation that this is a emotionally or irrationally driven type of behavior that comes from ignorance and bias. It's more complicated than that. But first, let's think about this. What is a hate crime, and who gets to decide? So it's really gets in that maybe we need to rethink what counts as a hate crime and figure out new language of targeted violence towards oppressed populations by oppressors, be it gender violence, sexual, or violence around sexual orientation, race, class, even. And what's driving it. And my education, my learnings is primarily race focused within particularly the Black American experience and study of whiteness in comparison to blackness. And so my education is definitely not as deep in other aspects of this, particularly in Asian American history, the diversity of Asian history and gender and violence around sexual orientation as well. Not nearly as deep, but it's there. But I like anybody that has blind spots, or how you should operate is default towards what experts are telling you instead of necessarily full on critiquing. Oh, I don't believe that. Is listen and try and learn and work with that language. But it falls short, especially with racialized violence by white men. and again continually falls short when we talk about gender and sexual ID and class violence. We do have class violence. Within this, we have the fetishization of so-called the correct term, exotic women, and using that term intentionally because this is it's a cultural marker. Even if folk don't necessarily use this, it's a marker of otherness, right? In the United States, whiteness, and particularly white men, is the default. When people say Americans, we don't have qualifiers, or at least kind of general qualifiers for white Americans, or at least white Americans don't talk about themselves in such a way. They don't create these qualifiers. They become they're normal. They're the everyday folks. And you see that in dog whistle politics, real Americans, or that's normal Americans, working class. But we know what that means. It's a dog whistle. And then we have this history of hypersexualizing the other, particularly Asian and Black women. This has led to massive amounts of violence. But we also see this hypersexualization with Latin women and Indigenous women and beyond. It's really kind of the idea of the other. Now, it's not to downplay the overt sexualization of women in general, which happens, but there is a hyper extension of this that predominantly targets women of color, and especially Asian and Black women. It presents a little bit differently in Asian and Black women, but that's a whole nother conversation for a different day. But we also have to ask ourselves why, when it comes to white mass murderers, do they get to set their own narrative? Or even their friends and family. We perpetually, and the media plays into this of going to friends and family and saying, well, they were church going, but that also ignores the massive history of religious colonization that still continues to this day through missionary practices and conversion therapy. And there's a lot of violence. Like, just because you are church going doesn't mean you can't enact violence. And in fact, we know that oftentimes that's quite the opposite, and that religion can drive this. Keep that in mind. Just hold on to that thought for a second. Then these white men get labeled as lone wolves. We're ignoring the points of radicalization from the internet or within their personal network, as well as radicalization within their religion. Again, particularly when we come to white evangelicals, we have to think about there's real forms of radicalization within white evangelical churches. We're also within this not exploring the lives of victims, or at least the media generally isn't. Not to say that isn't there, but it's not the prevalent mainstream narrative from our larger media places. How they present these murderers is often as a way that we're supposed to understand them, that we're supposed to sympathize and empathize with them, and see that there is a path of reasonableness to their decision. That there's somehow, well, of course, he had a bad day, suffering from sex addiction, and he was religious. So this was a reasonable path that he could be pushed down for some reason. But, how it's told gives an aspect of reasonability to it. So this implication of a statement of temptation and then obvious targeting of Asian massage parlors. And as we know, and we don't know how many of them are actually sex workers. There's an assumption here that they were all sex workers because there are Asian massage parlors. There are Asian massage parlors that aren't, don't have anything to do with sex. And so there's that assumption, which is a racist assumption in of itself. Now, some may or may not have been, but we need to be careful to assume this. But we also need to recognize that sex work is absolutely valid work. Within all, weird intersecting things that we need to be careful about in how we engage and talk about this. And there's, again, the idea that he was a sex addict. Targeting Asian parlors indicates that this man objectified Asian women, fetishized and dehumanized Asian women. He used them, and then he felt because of this radicalization through his religion, at least what he claims, he decided this temptation needed to be put to an end. And so then he targeted and murdered Asian women. This is very, very, race and gender centric. And let's also be put in the context of the geography here. This was in Atlanta, and in the county Atlanta was in. And he drove to multiple Asian massage parlors. Atlanta sex work is quite prevalent, and the majority of the sex work is going to be by Black women. Not only, but there's a lot of Black women. So it's, again, like this. It was very racialized in the sense of how he viewed Asian women. So he dehumanized them. But what actions and motivations qualify as hate? And what is hate? It's an instrument of dehumanization, absolutely. But you don't have to hate somebody to dehumanize them. But dehumanization, even absence of hate, can lead to violence, which is kind of part of that. A hate crime, when we talk about these types of crime, doesn't get to the heart of it and perpetuates a false understanding of how race and racism and white supremacy, and particularly cisgendered patriarchal white supremacy, manifests itself in real world lived examples. It's much more complex, and it's really interesting because people say it's not. Well, studying these things, they try to say, well, it's not rocket science. Actually, it is rocket science. The studying and understanding of complex human behavior in a social context is very, very hard and difficult to work through. The brilliant folks spending their lives studying this stuff. And you have experts on this stuff. And the assumption that this isn't complex, that it can be boiled down to ignorance and hate, is a lie. And again, it's a lie that we like to tell ourselves as a society because it makes things simpler. It makes these aspects, these events, it helps wash the hands of particularly white folks and well-meaning white folks who might not necessarily buy into the ideology of racism, or beyond the extreme end in perpetuating it. This is also attached to the history of the United States empire as Asian sex workers in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, where our military has expanded its reach for a while now. In the Pacific Islands, Asian women were looked upon as in subservient positions, in both just general service as well as sex workers, and companions to our soldiers. This is a growth of that, and let's be clear, our empire is absolutely one based in white supremacy and colonialism, which is part of that. Yeah, this is a false idea that this violence comes from ignorance and hate, that this causes racist ideas to perpetuate. Racial capitalism wasn't born from racist ideas, but from self-interest. The greed and thirst for power that drove imperialism and colonialism needed ideas to justify itself, just as the Crusade before them. The Crusades were actions of wealthy European nobles and the powerful church to have power, to gain influence, to gain wealth. action acted within their self-interest and drummed up, anti-Muslim ideas and rhetoric and thought to justify their actions. Dr. Ibram Kendi, who wrote How to Be Anti-Racist, which personally I think focuses far too much on individual actions and not systems and powers and even policies, but I mean, he gets to it, and particularly when it gets to racial capitalism. This is in my book and others too. It's been critiqued by others that have spent years studying the ideas of anti-racism. So I should have put together some names for y'all, but I do suggest reaching out and exploring those critiques. Some of them are pretty interesting. Not to say, ignore his writings. He's got some really great stuff in it, but like anybody, nobody gets it perfect. You have your shortcomings, and part of reading through a lot of these folks is learning how to spot those shortcomings, learning where to make up, where you can gain that knowledge elsewhere and pick up from the shortcomings, and not taking anything that they say as gospel, but as informative, as part of a growing and learning journey. But anyways, he goes on within this to say, and kind of that point is, I had been taught that racist ideas cause racist policies, that ignorance and hate cause racist ideas, that the root of racism is ignorance and hate. But that gets the chain of events exactly wrong. The root of the problem has always been the self-interest of racist power. It is much about, that's kind of where quote stop. But it's as much about racist practices and policies as it is about racist ideas and ideology. The ideas and the racist ideas and ideology is the fertilizer, but the policies and practices were there before. It becomes a self-feeding cycle, and it's hard to break, because you do have to target the ideas, but you also, and I think more importantly, have to target the policies. And Stokely Carmichael had a quote on this of a man can want to lynch me, and that's his problem. But if a man has the power to lynch me, that's my problem. And you talk about, goes on to theorize how racism isn't a question of hate, it's a question of power. If you had the power to enact these things, then this guy felt like he had the power, and in fact we see this. No doubt he'll face legal consequences, but the fact is he was able to purchase a gun within 8 hours before the shooting, and then it's easier to purchase a gun in Alabama than it is to vote. And our policies help perpetuate this idea of subservient Asian and sex work, and kind of this down the line, our policies of demonizing sex work, are how we look at and how these religious institutions behave within their ideology, and how we let them have tax breaks to radicalize people. They're very much political. They aren't apolitical organizations. Religion isn't apolitical. I'm sorry, it's not. And then we also have to look at our policies that grew and fed the model minority myth of Asian populations, which has then been used to justify the continued repression of Black and brown populations within the United States. There's been a long history of anti-Asian policies and rhetoric in this country, such as the Chinese Exclusionary Act, when after our country got done using Chinese labor to replace, to help with sharecropping as newly freed Black men, Black people, freedmen, moved off plantation, as well as to help build a railroad, particularly in the West, as practically indentured servants. This labor started to be less and less needed, but it's really as a way that they particularly, part of the immigration was to bring in cheap labor to replace slave labor, and it displaced white workers in a way. But then, of course, these policies led to resentment and hate by these white workers. And then, of course, these, wealthy folks drummed up, narratives and conspiracies and anti-Asian rhetoric, again, for their own self-interest. It doesn't matter if they actually believe this stuff or not. It was all in their own self-interest. It was all in for the acquisition of land and business and wealth and power. But so you have the Chinese Exclusionary Act that got to really cut down on Asian immigration and removed actually a lot of immigrants from China and Asian immigrants in general. And there was a massive Asian immigration was very low up until the 1970s. And up to this point, most Asian immigrants that came into the United States up until that point came from wealthier, more educated families. And we know that education and wealth are much more of an indicator of further economic and educational attainment. It has nothing to do with culture or families. And I mean, as somebody that just it's I mean that itself is a myth. Black families, Black and brown families, absolutely value education, absolutely value hard work and family. We have different aspects of family, and we actually know that what we come to know as the nuclear family isn't necessarily that great and isn't always that strong. The CDC released a study a handful of years ago that showed Black fathers were far more involved in the children's lives than white fathers. But yet we still use the indication of fatherless Black children or single mother households without realizing that you can have a different type of family and still have a strong family unit, even if there's not marriage, or even if there's there's a lot of different ways to have a strong family unit. Again, are myths. But up in the 1970s, new policies allowed particularly Southeast Asians en masse into the United States. This particularly came with unifying families because of the Vietnam War, again, a war of American imperialism. And we started seeing that since the 1970s, a large influx, particularly of Southeast Asian immigrants, which partly because of wars of American imperialism came to the United States as poorer and less educated. There's actually over the last Pew did a study on income gaps and Asian income inequality is on the rise, and is actually rising faster than any other population in the United States. But this is part of us not recognizing the diversity of the Asian American experience. And who we still like to let in, we still preferably to let in, particularly starting in the 90s, those coming from Asia, particularly, we saw more of an influx from India, again, more likely to be well off or higher educated with our tech booms. But again, we're not thinking about this in the diversity of Asian populations. I mean, Asia is as diverse as a continent as any other continent, particularly when we talk about diversity of cultures and peoples and languages. I mean, even within each nation, China, which is doing a genocide of some of it right now, a mass genocide of its Muslim population that we're barely talking about, that still has control over Tibet and other, I don't know if ethnicity is the right word here. Ethnicities is the right word here, but just different types of historically Asian people that aren't what we think of as Chinese, and China is still very much an empire. You have Japan, you have Hmong populations, we have Vietnamese, and even within Vietnam, you have Hmong populations, you have Buddhist populations. There's religious aspects to this, there's cultural aspects to this. But we also realize, particularly in Southeast Asia, a lot of these national dividing lines is because of colonialism. They're not natural, just like within the Middle East and Africa. These were drawn up because of imperialism. And I only have a high level familiarity with some of this stuff, and particularly with Hmong populations, Chinese, Korean, of that heritage, of that history. don't even, I'm barely approaching the tip of the iceberg when it comes to knowing and understanding the vast amount of cultures and cultural history within the Asian continent. There's so much there, and a lot's been wiped out because of colonialism, and a lot's still there. But we don't learn about these things. We don't think about these things, particularly when we think about Asian Americans. We barely learn about this stuff. We barely learn about the history of Asian immigration in this country, of anti-Asian violence, of from Japanese internment camps. Which, let's be real, I mean, American Germans didn't have internment camps, and in fact, German POWs that were stationed in the United States, a lot of them were treated better than Japanese Americans in these internment camps. It's deep. But these ideas and policies aren't limited from those that come from the conservative end of the spectrum. And the seemingly lesser ideas and actions of particularly white liberals help perpetuate all of this too. Well-meaning paternalistic racism help perpetuate these disparities. Or even things like the Peace Corps. Right? Instead of investing or stop robbing from some of these nations that our economic and global economic policies do, where we extract more resources than we put in, instead of pulling back empire and lessening or not having our strict economic policies. We had the Marshall Plan for Europe, which had pretty loose economic policies, but we can't do Marshall types of plans elsewhere, particularly to help rebuild nations that we have decimated through war and colonialism and imperialism. In fact, some of these nations are still paying back or paying nations for their freedom. And they were colonized. Some can't, due to treaties that were made, can't even make their own currency. But this is again part of all of that. And so then we put these limitations on these nations. And then from the outside we say, well, these asshole countries, right? We look at them as lesser than. And we look at the people that come from them as lesser than, but yet we continue and perpetually rob them. Same thing happens here. It's the idea that we must save people of color. But this bears the question, save them from whom? And the answer is always white people or white nations. How this might have, a broader aspect that has shown in the United States is, let's think about this within aspect of the Federal Housing Authority. Helped build white middle class. And it locked Black Americans out of housing access. Now, this building a black middle class and not black, sorry, the white middle class through the GI Bill and such helped really expand this wealth for white Americans. And then we talk about economic disparities and down the line, and then people talk about, well, because of these economic disparities, Black people are more likely to be poor. So then it becomes confused with let's help poor people equals let's help Black people, without understanding that a Black middle class family is just as likely is going to be living in the equivalent of a poor white neighborhood economically, right? The disparities exist across class. So even if you eliminate poverty in this country, we're still going to have economic disparities. The anti-racist behavior here would be addressing the reason why the disparities existed to begin with. That's anti-racist. And so we have to really think about this and why you might think helping poor people equals helping Black people. Well, it's going to disproportionately help Black people. But Black people don't equal poor people. And some of this colorblind approach is interesting, or even affirmative action. All right, we talk about but who's benefited the most from affirmative action? And that is white women. Colorblind approach don't eliminate disparities. But this brings us back around to these killings and the killings of all people of color by white Americans or by the state. Liberal white folks, where many still don't fully grasp the extent of white supremacy in this nation, particularly in policies and institutions, become awake to the things people of color are suffering to or suffering from, but somehow ignore us when we're saying we're in danger, that you're hurting us, that this is going on. How long, it took up to this point for white folks to notice that anti-Asian hate and violence was on the rise. They've been talking about, folks in American and Asian communities have been talking about this even before the pandemic. And then somehow we ignore a lot of this stuff. And right now, a big example, we're ignoring that the fact that there was a bomb set off in Nashville by a white man who believed in right-wing conspiracies. And we're not talking about that. But that's a big thing. It's part of this. So basically, effectively, white people, even well-meaning white folks, end up looking at those murdered at the hands of white supremacy, be it from the state or non-state actors, as martyrs. On one hand, they mistaken us for holding up their names as us making them into a martyr, and on the other, look upon as these events and the people who helped see them as the people who helped see them, the truth of the world. Well, failing to see, they're still not seeing the whole world, the whole truth. And the truth is, when we die, we are not martyrs. We don't make those who die into martyrs. We mourn their deaths and celebrate their life, but they are not martyrs. When we are killed or when we die, we didn't die for white people. We don't die for the cause. When we die, we don't die for white people. We die because of white people. We don't die, again, for the cause. We fight for the cause to stop dying, to stop being oppressed. We don't hold them up as martyrs, but as ancestors and kin taken from us too soon, especially because we don't see them as dying for us, again, or from the cause, let alone in dying to help white people see the truth. And if we have to die for you to support our cause, for you to be awake, that says something about you. It says something about white people. It shouldn't require for our deaths for white folks to wake up. And they still haven't woken up. Most voted for Trump. And most still support the GOP. Somehow this idea that racism isn't pervasive, isn't systematic, is downplayed by so many. Even those that believe it exists, it's still downplayed. The spectrum feeds the little seed of those that think they're allies and thinking, these black folks are martyrs. It ends up leading to this, again, this paternalistic racism, which ends up dehumanizing black folks and brown folks and those from Asian background, Asian Americans, because they died for the benefit of white folks. That's part of that dehumanization. This grows into much more and feeds into extremists and their racism. But a lot of this has to do, again, with policy. Well-meaning white folks and the behavior here perpetuates this system by ignoring our calls until a brutal death happens. They can't, ignore when it hits them in the face. But even then, they fail to properly interrogate the systems. This specific instance is a failure to interrogate the history of laws and practices targeting Asian Americans. It's a failure to see sex work as a legitimate work. It's a failure to see the history of U.S. wars of imperialism feeding into the mentality of particularly of subservient Asian women, especially one of sex workers. On top of the failure to interrogate the history of Christian white nationalism and missionaries that bring their ideas of needing to civilize the so-called savage and to purify the temptation that black or Asian women present to white men. Our criminal justice systems and policies and practices dehumanize black and brown and Asian bodies. Our local policies demonize those suffering from homelessness. Well, those particularly working close to homeless populations know of the violence they face by the state and non-state actors. But our policies that perpetuate homelessness lead to the violence and dehumanization by folks on the streets that non-homeless people accosting violence upon homelessness. So as long as white folks, or as long as people of color have to die for white folks to get it, we'll always be dying. We'll never be free. This will always be an excuse for whiteness and dehumanizing effects that it has on all of us. So effectively, this was a problem that people of color suffer under, but it's a white people problem that affects people of color. You have to deconstruct white supremacy and whiteness, and to engage those in your network, in your neighborhood, not to try and understand how they got to where they are as white nationalists, because the GOP is the party of white nationalism, but to actively deconstruct these ideas and to actively deconstruct these policies. But you have to also center Black and brown and Asian voice, our voices and our actions, and empower, hand over that social power to make decisions for ourselves and our communities. I mean, I could go on about this, and I'm running up against time, so I'll definitely call this. But really interrogate this, and interrogate the narratives. Don't just be outraged, but interrogate mentalities and policies and how these things feed into each other. Sit and think with this discomfort and why you might think the way you do. I'm not saying any specific way that you are thinking, but just be mindful of these things. But that's it for this week. Thanks for coming to Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I am Matthew Browning here at Madison 365. You can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. Please hit subscribe, share, do all that fun jazz. If you like it, again, please let folks know. So thanks for coming. Mask up, stay safe, get your vaccine if you can do it, and have yourselves a good week. Thanks. Have a good one. Bye.
This is 365 Media.